before he became the greatest writer in the English language, before kings and queens listened to his words, before the world memorized his poetry, he was simply a boy from a small town. His name was William Shakespeare. He was born in April 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, a quiet market town in England. The town was not famous. It was peaceful, surrounded by fields, rivers, and farms. People lived simple lives. They worked hard. They followed traditions. No one in Stratford could imagine that this small town would one day be known across the entire world. William's father, John Shakespeare, was a glove maker and local businessman. He worked with leather and sold goods in the marketplace. At one time, he was respected in town and even held public office. His mother, Mary Arden, came from a farming family. She was likely gentle, practical, and strong. William grew up in a house filled with siblings. Life was not luxurious, but it was comfortable in his early childhood. England during this time was ruled by Queen Elizabeth I. It was a period of change. The country was becoming stronger. Exploration was expanding. Art and literature were beginning to flourish. But Stratford was still simple. And in this simple town, a boy was quietly observing everything. The power of education. William likely attended the local grammar school. Education during that time was strict. Students studied Latin, classical literature, and Roman writers. They memorized long passages. They learned discipline. Young William read stories of ancient heroes. He studied Roman playwrights like Seneca and Plautus. He learned about powerful leaders, tragic endings, and dramatic speeches. Even as a child, he would have heard powerful language echoing in his classroom. Words became familiar to him. Words became tools. Words became magic. But education was not only inside school walls. Outside, Stratford offered its own lessons. Traveling performers sometimes visited town. Actors staged plays in open areas. Crowds gathered to watch dramatic stories unfold. Young William may have stood in those crowds, watching with wide eyes, listening, imagining. Something inside him must have awakened during those moments. Shadows over the family. When William was still young, his father's financial situation began to decline. John Shakespeare faced money troubles. He lost his public positions. The family's social status weakened. For a young boy, this would have been confusing. He had seen respect. Now he saw struggle. He had seen stability. Now he saw uncertainty. These early experiences may have shaped his understanding of power, pride, loss, and reputation, themes that would later appear in his plays. Life was teaching him before he even knew he would become a writer. Love and responsibility. At the age of 18, William made a decision that changed his life. He married Anne Hathaway and was 8 years older than him. Soon after, they had a daughter named Susanna. Later, twins were born, Hamlet and Judith. William was now a husband, a father. Responsibility had arrived early, but something inside him was still restless. Stratford was peaceful, perhaps too peaceful. Opportunities were limited. The world outside was changing quickly. London was growing. Theater was becoming popular. New ideas were spreading. And somewhere in his heart, William must have felt it. Stratford was not big enough for his imagination. The lost years. Then something mysterious happened. Between the birth of his twins in 1585 and his appearance in London several years later, history becomes silent. These years are often called Shakespeare's lost years. What did he do? Some believe he worked as a teacher. Others say he may have worked with traveling theater groups. Some legends even suggest he left town suddenly after a disagreement with a local landowner. The truth remains uncertain. But what we do know is this. When he finally appears in London records in the early 1590s, he is already involved in theater, already writing, already rising. This means those silent years were not empty. They were preparation. They were transformation. Somewhere between Stratford and London, a writer was being born, the quiet beginning of greatness. It is important to understand something powerful. William Shakespeare did not grow up in royal courts. He was not born into literary greatness. He did not have famous teachers guiding him. He was a small-town boy with education, imagination, and observation. He saw how people behaved. He noticed pride, jealousy, love, ambition, fear. These emotions lived in Stratford just as they lived in kings and queens. And one day, he would give those emotions words, words that would last forever. But before that could happen, he had to leave home. He had to take a risk. He had to step into a larger world. London was waiting. The stage was waiting. And history was about to meet its greatest storyteller. Part 2, London, the birth of a playwright. London in the late 1500s was not the clean, shining capital we imagine today. It was crowded, loud, dirty, alive. When William Shakespeare arrived in London, he stepped into a city overflowing with energy. Merchants shouted in markets. Horses ran through narrow streets. Sailors returned from distant lands. Nobles rode past in fine clothes while beggars searched for coins. The River Thames carried ships and stories from across the world. London was opportunity, but it was also danger. Disease spread easily. The plague sometimes forced businesses to close. Poverty and wealth lived side by side. For a young man from Stratford, the city must have felt overwhelming. But it also offered something Stratford could not. The theater, the world of the stage. Theater in Elizabethan England was exploding in popularity. Public playhouses had been built outside the strict control of city officials. Crowds gathered to watch comedies, tragedies, and historical dramas. Rich nobles watched from private balconies. Poor laborers stood in the yard below. Everyone loved a good story. One of the most important theaters was simply called the Globe Theatre. Though it would rise slightly later in Shakespeare's career, its spirit already existed in earlier playhouses like the Theatre and the Curtain. The stage was open to the sky. The actors wore colorful costumes. There were no microphones, no lights, no special effects, only voices, only words, only imagination. And William Shakespeare was stepping into this world. Struggle before success. At first, Shakespeare was not famous. He may have worked as an actor. He may have helped rewrite old plays. He may have done small tasks just to survive. London was competitive. Many writers were already there, including talented dramatists like Christopher Marlowe, whose bold and powerful plays were already popular. Shakespeare had to prove himself. He had to show that his words were different, stronger, more alive. There were critics who doubted him. One writer insulted him publicly, calling him an upstart crow, suggesting that Shakespeare was rising too quickly and did not belong among educated scholars. But criticism did not stop him. If anything, it pushed him forward, finding his voice. In the early 1590s, Shakespeare began writing plays that attracted attention. His early works included historical dramas about English kings. He wrote about power struggles, wars, betrayal, and loyalty. These plays were not just entertainment. They made audiences feel proud of England's history. He understood something important. People loved to see their own stories reflected on stage. He also began writing comedies filled with clever wordplay, misunderstandings, romance, and humor. His dialogue sparkled. His characters felt real. He did not write simple heroes or villains. He wrote humans, people with strengths and weaknesses, people who loved deeply and failed painfully. London audiences began to recognize his talent, and slowly, his name began to spread. Company of his own. Shakespeare did something unusual for a writer of his time. He did not just write plays. He became part owner of a theater company. He joined a group known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men. This was important. It meant financial security. It meant influence. It meant stability. When the company later built the Globe Theatre in 1599, Shakespeare became a shareholder. He was not just writing stories, he was building an empire of performance. The Globe became the heart of London theatre, and Shakespeare became its strongest voice, the plague and persistence. But success did not come without interruption. Several times, the plague forced theaters to close. When the city shut down, actors could not perform. Writers could not stage plays. Income stopped. During these difficult times, Shakespeare turned to poetry. He wrote narrative poems and sonnets. Beautiful, emotional reflections on love, time, beauty, jealousy, and mortality. These poems showed another side of him, not just the dramatist, but the philosopher, the observer of the human heart, a rising star. By the end of the 1590s, Shakespeare was no longer an unknown writer. He was respected. His plays were performed before Queen Elizabeth I herself. The boy from Stratford had entered royal courts. His words were spoken before nobles and commoners alike. He had crossed the boundary between ordinary life and artistic greatness. But something even more powerful was about to happen. He was about to create characters who would live forever, lovers who would die for each other, princes who would question existence, warriors consumed by ambition, jealous men destroyed by suspicion. The next stage of his life would not just make him successful. It would make him immortal. Part 3: Genius Unleashed. By the turn of the 17th century, London knew his name. The Globe Theatre was full. Crowds gathered before performances. Actors trusted his scripts. Audiences waited for his next story. But something inside Shakespeare was changing. His writing was becoming deeper, darker, more powerful. He was no longer just entertaining people. He was exploring the human soul, the tragedy of young love. One of his most famous plays during this time was Romeo and Juliet. It told the story of two young lovers from rival families. Their love was pure, but their world was filled with hatred. The audience watched hope grow and then shatter. For the first time, many people saw their own emotions reflected on stage. The intensity of young love, the pain of loss, the tragedy of misunderstanding. Shakespeare understood something universal. Love is powerful, but society can destroy it. Even today, centuries later, those two names still symbolize romantic tragedy. The prince who questioned life. Then came Hamlet, a story about a young prince whose father is murdered. But this was not just a revenge story. Hamlet thinks. He doubts. He questions everything, even existence itself. To be or not to be. With those words, Shakespeare gave the world one of the most famous lines in literature. Hamlet does not simply act. He struggles with fear, morality, hesitation, and truth. For the first time, audiences saw a hero who was deeply human, confused, broken, brilliant. Shakespeare was no longer writing characters. He was creating living minds, jealousy and destruction. In Othello, he explored jealousy. A respected general is manipulated into believing his wife is unfaithful. A whisper becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes obsession. Obsession becomes tragedy. Shakespeare showed how a single lie can destroy a life. He understood how fragile trust can be. He showed that the greatest enemy is sometimes not outside us, but inside us. Ambition and darkness. Then came Macbeth. A brave warrior hears a prophecy that he will become king. The idea enters his mind. Ambition begins to grow. Encouraged by his wife, he commits murder. But power gained through blood brings guilt, fear, madness. Shakespeare explored ambition in its most dangerous form. He showed how desire for power can destroy honor, friendship, and peace. The audience did not just watch Macbeth fall. They felt it, because ambition lives inside everyone. The king who lost everything. In King Lear, Shakespeare told the story of an aging king who divides his kingdom among his daughters. He believes flattery. He rejects honesty. And slowly he loses everything. Power, family, sanity. The play is painful, raw, emotional. It reveals how pride blinds us, how love misunderstood leads to tragedy, how authority without wisdom collapses. By this time, Shakespeare had mastered human emotion. He wrote about love, betrayal, ambition, jealousy, madness, aging, and death, not as distant ideas, but as living experiences. The theater and the crown. During this period, England changed rulers. After Queen Elizabeth I died, King James I took the throne. Shakespeare's acting company received royal support and became known as the King's Men. Royal approval strengthened his position. His plays were performed at court. He had reached the highest levels of society. But fame did not make him careless. His writing became even richer, even more poetic, even more fearless. Personal shadow. Yet while his artistic life flourished, tragedy struck his personal life. His only son, Hamlet, died at the age of 11. The loss must have been devastating. Many scholars believe this personal sorrow deepened Shakespeare's tragedies. Pain changes a writer. Loss reshapes perspective. Perhaps the grief of a father echoes in the sadness of King Lear. Perhaps the name Hamlet reflects the memory of Hamlet. We cannot know for certain, but we can feel the depth. His later works carry emotional weight that feels real, because it was the language that changed the world. Shakespeare did something extraordinary. He expanded the English language. He invented new words, new phrases, new expressions. Many everyday phrases we use today first appeared in his plays. He gave English flexibility, beauty, power. He made ordinary language poetic, and poetic language understandable. That balance made him timeless, the height of his genius. By the early 1600s, Shakespeare was at his peak. He had written comedies that made audiences laugh, tragedies that made them cry, histories that made them proud. His characters felt more real than some real people. They struggled with the same emotions humans still struggle with today. That is why his works survive. Because human nature has not changed. Love still hurts. Ambition still tempts. Jealousy still destroys. Power still corrupts. And Shakespeare understood it all. But even genius cannot stop time. The Globe Theatre would soon face disaster. Life would begin to slow. And the boy from Stratford, who conquered London with words, would begin thinking about home again. Part 4: Fame, Loss, and the Final Works. By the early 1600s, William Shakespeare was no longer struggling. He was successful, respected, financially secure. His company, the King's Men, performed regularly before King James I. The Globe Theatre was thriving. His plays were widely admired. The boy from Stratford had conquered London. But life does not pause for success, continues, and sometimes it tests even the greatest minds. The burning of the globe. In 1613, during a performance of one of his historical plays, a cannon effect was fired on stage. The spark caught the wooden roof. Within minutes, flames spread across the theater. The globe burned to the ground. For the audience, it was shocking. For Shakespeare and his company, it was devastating. The building that had held his greatest triumphs, the stage where his words came alive, reduced to ashes. But the story did not end there. The theater was rebuilt the following year. Stronger, more determined. The fire was a reminder that even greatness can be fragile, but resilience can rebuild it. A softer tone. In his later years, Shakespeare's writing began to change. The dark tragedies of Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear gave way to something different. His final plays carried sadness but also forgiveness, loss but also reconciliation. One of these final masterpieces was The Tempest. The play tells the story of Prospero, a magician who has been betrayed and exiled on an island. Prospero has power. He can take revenge. But in the end, he chooses forgiveness. He breaks his magic staff. He prepares to return home. Many believe Prospero represents Shakespeare himself, a man who mastered his craft, who shaped worlds with words, and who was now ready to let go. The tone feels reflective, almost like a goodbye, returning to Stratford. Around this time, Shakespeare began spending more time back in Stratford-upon-Avon. He had purchased a large house there called New Place. He invested in property. He lived comfortably. The man who once left the town with uncertainty had returned with success. Perhaps he walked familiar streets and remembered his childhood. Perhaps he thought about the long journey from grammar school student to royal playwright. Perhaps he simply wanted peace. After decades of noise, crowds, and performance, silence may have felt beautiful. The final curtain. On April 23, 1616, William Shakespeare died at the age of 52. The cause of his death remains uncertain. He was buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. On his grave, an unusual warning was carved. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Even in death there was mystery, but what is remarkable is this. At the time of his death, he was respected, but not yet immortal. That transformation would come soon after. The first folio. In 1623, 7 years after his death, 2 of his fellow actors gathered his plays and published them in a collection known as the First Folio. Without this effort, many of his greatest works might have been lost forever. The First Folio preserved masterpieces like Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Twelfth Night. This single book protected his legacy. And from that moment, his influence began to grow beyond imagination. The man who understood humanity. Shakespeare did not write about gods. He did not write about distant legends alone. He wrote about people, fathers and daughters, friends and enemies, lovers and rivals. He explored ambition, fear, loyalty, betrayal, mercy, pride, jealousy, hope. He showed that kings suffer like common men, and common men can feel like kings. His stories crossed class boundaries. They crossed centuries. They crossed cultures. Because human nature remains the same. The stage lights were dimming. The applause was fading. But the echo of his words was only beginning. His physical life ended in 1616. But his real life, the life inside books, classrooms, theaters, and hearts, was just beginning. Part 5: The Man Who Never Died. On April 23, 1616, William Shakespeare was buried in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. There were no worldwide headlines, no grand national ceremony, no prediction that this man would become the most studied writer in history. He was respected, but not yet legendary. The true power of his life would unfold slowly, quietly, powerfully, the book that saved him. 7 years after his death in 1623, two of his fellow actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, made a decision that changed literary history. They gathered his plays and published them in a collection known as the First Folio. Without this book, many masterpieces might have disappeared forever. Plays like Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Julius Caesar. These works survived because someone believed they mattered. The First Folio did more than preserve plays, preserved a voice, and that voice began traveling far beyond England. The language that lives everywhere. Shakespeare did something few writers achieve. He changed the English language itself. He introduced hundreds of new words and expressions. Many phrases we use today first appeared in his works. He made language flexible, expressive, musical. He could write poetry that felt royal, and dialogue that felt natural. He gave English the ability to express deep emotion in simple words. That is why students across the world still study him. Not because he is old, but because he is alive in language, crossing borders and centuries. His plays did not remain in London. They traveled across Europe, across oceans, across centuries. They were translated into dozens of languages, performed in royal courts and small village theaters, adapted into films, books, and modern interpretations. His story of star-crossed lovers in Romeo and Juliet became universal. His exploration of ambition in Macbeth still warns leaders today. His questioning of existence in Hamlet still echoes in classrooms and theaters worldwide. Cultures change, technology advances, but human emotions remain. And Shakespeare understood human emotion better than almost anyone. The mystery that remains. Even today, debates continue. Some question whether Shakespeare truly wrote all the plays attributed to him. Others defend his authorship strongly. The mystery adds another layer to his legend. But regardless of debate, one truth remains clear. The works exist. The impact is undeniable. The influence is global. A man from a small town shaped world literature. The immortal stage. In Stratford-upon-Avon, visitors walk the streets he once walked. They visit his birthplace. They stand near his grave. They imagine the young boy reading Latin in grammar school. But his true home is not only in Stratford. It is wherever his words are spoken. Whenever an actor performs To Be or Not to Be, whenever two young lovers defy their families, whenever a leader struggles with ambition, Shakespeare lives. Why he still matters. Why does he remain relevant more than 400 years later? Because he did not write about one time. He wrote about all time. He wrote about love that feels unstoppable, jealousy that feels uncontrollable, ambition that feels irresistible, fear that feels overwhelming. He showed us ourselves. And when a writer shows humanity its own reflection, that writer never truly dies. The final reflection. Imagine the boy from Stratford, watching traveling actors perform in the town square, listening to stories, feeling something awaken inside him. He could not have known that his words would outlive empires, that his stories would be studied in universities across continents, that his name would become a symbol of literary greatness. He simply wrote, he observed, he imagined, and through imagination he achieved immortality. William Shakespeare's life was not filled with royal power or military conquest. He did not rule nations. He ruled language. He ruled emotion. He ruled the stage. From 1564 to 1616, he lived as a man. But through his words, he became eternal.